Rich woman mocks. Veteran in a restaurant. Her reaction. When his son arrives, will shock you. The sun-drenched interior of Le Jardin, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, buzzed with the low hum of polite conversation and the gentle clink of fine china. Sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow on the crisp white tablecloths and gleaming silverware. The air was perfumed with the delicate aroma of fresh-cut flowers and the tantalizing scents wafting from the kitchen. At a prime table near the center of the room sat Margaret Lawson, her perfectly coiffed silver hair catching the light as she threw her head back in laughter. Her companions, a trio of equally well-heeled women, joined in, their voices carrying just a touch too loudly across the otherwise subdued dining room. "Oh, Vivian," Margaret said, dabbing at the corner of her eye with a linen napkin. "You simply must tell Charles to buy you that necklace. After all, what else is the point of having money if not to spoil ourselves a little?" Vivian nodded, a conspiratorial smile playing at her lips. "Perhaps you're right, Margaret. And speaking of spoiling ourselves, how was your trip to the Maldives? I heard you rented out an entire island." Margaret's eyes lit up at the opportunity to regale her friends with tales of her latest extravagance. "It was absolutely divine," she began, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "The beaches were like powder, the water so clear you could see straight to the bottom. And the service, why, they anticipated our every need before we even knew we had them." As Margaret launched into a detailed description of her private villa and the celebrity chef flown in for their personal use, a quiet figure slipped into the restaurant. James Porter moved with the measured grace of a man who had spent a lifetime in service, his steps sure despite the slight stiffness in his left leg. His weathered face spoke of years spent under harsh suns and in unforgiving climates, a stark contrast to the meticulously maintained complexions of the restaurant's usual clientele. James's simple attire, a well-worn but clean jacket over a pressed shirt and khakis, stood out among the designer labels and bespoke suits that populated Le Jardin. As he was led to a small table near the window, more than a few heads turned, curious gazes following his progress through the dining room. Margaret, in the midst of describing a particularly lavish sunset dinner on the beach, caught sight of James as he settled into his chair. Her story faltered for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she took in his appearance. "Well," she said, her voice dropping to a stage whisper, "it seems the maitre d' is slipping in his standards. Look at that shabby man over there. Can you believe they let him in?" Her companions turned, not even attempting to be subtle in their scrutiny. Vivian clicked her tongue in disapproval. "How dreadful," she murmured. "He looks like he's wandered in from the street. Surely there must be some mistake." Margaret's lips curled into a sneer, her earlier good humor evaporating in the face of what she perceived as an affront to the restaurant's exclusivity, and by extension, her own status. "Perhaps we should have a word with management," she suggested, her tone leaving little doubt that she was only half joking. "After all, we pay good money to dine here. The least they could do is maintain a certain ambiance." As her friends nodded in agreement, Margaret's voice grew louder, her words clearly intended to carry to nearby tables. "Do they let just anyone in here these days? I thought Le Jardin had standards." The effect of her words was immediate. A ripple of discomfort spread through the nearby tables, patrons shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to acknowledge the cruel remarks or pretend they hadn't heard. A few shot sympathetic glances towards James, who sat calmly perusing his menu, seemingly oblivious to the stir his presence had caused. But James was far from unaware. Years of military training had honed his senses, making him acutely attuned to his surroundings. He heard every word, felt every judgmental stare, yet he remained composed, his posture straight, his expression serene. He had faced far worse than the petty cruelty of entitled socialites. As a young waiter approached James's table, visibly nervous about serving a client so different from their usual fare, Margaret's voice rose again. "I suppose we should be grateful," she drawled, sarcasm dripping from every word. "It's not every day we get dinner and a show. Shall we place bets on whether he can afford the soup, or if he'll have to wash dishes to pay for his meal. Her friends tittered, emboldened by Margaret's audacity. The waiter, his cheeks flushing with second-hand embarrassment, fumbled with his notepad as he took James's order. To his surprise, the older man smiled kindly at him, his voice low and reassuring as he requested a simple meal. Margaret, watching the interaction with hawk-like intensity, scoffed. Well, at least he has the decency to order something cheap, though I doubt even the daily special is within his budget. As Margaret's taunts continued, growing bolder with each passing moment, the atmosphere in Le Jardin grew increasingly tense. Other diners shifted uncomfortably, torn between their distaste for such blatant cruelty and their reluctance to involve themselves in the situation. The staff exchanged worried glances, unsure of how to handle the escalating situation without offending one of their most valued patrons. Through it all, James remained a pillar of calm. He sipped his water, his eyes occasionally drifting to the window beside him, taking in the bustling street outside. To the casual observer, he might have appeared oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. But there was a tightness around his eyes, a slight tension in his shoulders that betrayed his awareness. As the waiter returned with James's meal, a modest plate of grilled fish and vegetables, Margaret's voice once again rose above the murmur of conversation. "Oh, look," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "It seems our charity case has managed to scrape together enough for a real meal. How heartwarming." The cruelty of her words hung in the air, a palpable weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the restaurant. And yet, as all eyes turned towards James, expecting perhaps to see him shrink under the onslaught of Margaret's mockery, they were met with a sight that would stay with them long after the meal was over. James Porter, decorated veteran and unassuming hero, simply bowed his head for a moment, a quiet prayer of gratitude on his lips. Then, with the dignity of a man who had faced far greater challenges than the petty jibes of a stranger, he began to eat his meal, savoring each bite as if it were the finest cuisine in the world. In that moment, though none of them yet realized it, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of Margaret's carefully constructed world and remind everyone present of the true meaning of worth and dignity. The gentle clinking of silverware against fine china filled the air of Le Jardin, a stark counterpoint to the growing tension that seemed to pulse through the room. Margaret Lawson, emboldened by the nervous laughter of her companions and the tacit compliance of the other diners, continued her verbal assault on James Porter with increasing vigor. "Did you see that jacket?" Margaret stage whispered, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to nearby tables. "I swear, I saw something similar in a donation bin last week. Perhaps we should start a collection to buy the poor man something more, appropriate for dining out." Her friends, caught between discomfort and a desire to maintain their social standing, offered weak chuckles and half-hearted agreements. Vivian, the most conflicted of the group, attempted to steer the conversation in a different direction. "Margaret, dear, tell us more about that charming little boutique you discovered in Paris. Didn't you say they had the most divine scarves?" But Margaret, intoxicated by the power she felt in humiliating someone she deemed beneath her, waved off Vivian's attempt at distraction. "Oh, we can discuss fashion any old time. It's not every day we get such interesting entertainment with our meal." As if on cue, a young waitress approached James's table, a pitcher of water in hand. Her movements were careful, almost apologetic, as she refilled his glass. James looked up at her with a kind smile, murmuring a soft, "Thank you, miss," that seemed to momentarily lift the weight of tension from her shoulders. Margaret, ever vigilant for new ammunition, pounced on this interaction. "Well, would you look at that?" she drawled, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "It seems our friend has some manners after all. Though I suppose when you're used to soup kitchens, any service must seem impressive." The waitress, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, turned towards Margaret's table. For a moment, it seemed she might speak up, defend the quiet dignity of the man she had just served. But years of training in customer service, of being told that the customer is always right, especially when that customer is as wealthy and influential as Margaret Lawson, held her tongue. Instead, she approached Margaret's table with a forced smile. "Is everything to your satisfaction, madam?" she asked, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Can I bring you anything else?" Margaret, either oblivious to or simply uncaring about the young woman's discomfort, waved a bejeweled hand dismissively. Yes, everything's fine. Though perhaps you could do something about the, atmosphere. It seems to have taken a rather unfortunate turn today." Her eyes flicked meaningfully towards James's table. The waitress, torn between her professional obligations and her sense of basic human decency, struggled to find a response. I'm sorry, madame, but all our patrons are valued guests. If there's an issue with your meal or service, I'd be happy to address it. But, oh, never mind, Margaret cut her off, her tone making it clear that the waitress had failed some unspoken test. "Just see to it that our glasses stay full. That's all you need to concern yourself with." As the waitress retreated, visibly shaken, Margaret turned back to her friends with a triumphant smirk. "Can you believe the help these days? No sense of standards at all. In my day, a restaurant like this would never have allowed someone so unsuitable to dine here." Vivian, emboldened by the wine and Margaret's apparent invulnerability, leaned in conspiratorially. "Perhaps he won some sort of contest?" she suggested, her voice low, but clearly audible to those around them. "You know, one of those charity things where they let the less fortunate experience how the other half lives for a day." Margaret's eyes lit up at this new avenue for mockery. "Oh, Vivian, you might be onto something there. Though I do hope they gave him some pointers on how to behave in polite society. It wouldn't do to have him slurping his soup or using the wrong fork." As Margaret and her friends continued their cruel speculations, the atmosphere in Le Jardin grew increasingly oppressive. Other diners shot furtive glances between James's table and Margaret's, their own meals forgotten in the face of the unfolding drama. Some wore expressions of discomfort, clearly disapproving of Margaret's behavior, but unwilling to intervene. Others, to their shame, found themselves reluctantly entertained by the spectacle, their own insecurities momentarily soothed by the idea that there was someone present even they could look down upon. Through it all, James Porter remained a study in composure. He ate his meal with slow, deliberate movements, occasionally pausing to gaze out the window at the busy street beyond. To the casual observer, he might have appeared oblivious to the cruel words being hurled in his direction. But there was a tightness around his eyes. Except instead of wild animals, we get to see how the other half fumbles through a proper meal. A few nervous titters rippled through the room, quickly stifled as people realized the full cruelty of Margaret's words. The maitre d', who had been hovering anxiously on the periphery of the dining room, seemed to steel himself for action. But before he could approach Margaret's table, a new figure appeared in the doorway of Le Jardin. The man who entered was the very picture of success and sophistication. His tailored suit spoke of wealth and taste, while his confident stride suggested a man accustomed to commanding respect. Heads turned as he made his way through the restaurant, Margaret and her friends included. "Now that," Margaret murmured appreciatively, her eyes following the newcomer's progress, "is more like the clientele this place should cater to. I wonder who he is." But as the man approached James's table, the smug smile froze on Margaret's face. The newcomer's voice, warm and filled with genuine affection, carried clearly across the now silent restaurant. "Hey, Dad. Sorry I'm a bit late." In that moment, as realization dawned on Margaret's face, and a collective gasp seemed to ripple through Le Jardin, the true measure of character, both James Porter's quiet dignity and Margaret Lawson's shallow cruelty, was laid bare for all to see. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of Margaret's carefully constructed world of privilege and prejudice. The arrival of the well-dressed young man sent ripples of curiosity through Le Jardin. Conversations faltered mid-sentence as diners craned their necks to get a better look at the newcomer who had commanded such attention merely by walking through the door. Even the staff, usually so adept at maintaining their professional demeanor, couldn't help but cast appreciative glances at the man's impeccably tailored suit, and the air of quiet confidence that surrounded him. The board meeting ran a bit long. James Porter's face lit up at the sight of his son, the lines of tension that had been etched around his eyes softening into smile lines. "No worries, son," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of the military crispness that had been ingrained in him over decades of service. "I was just enjoying the ambiance." If Daniel noticed the undercurrent of tension in his father's voice or the way other diners were openly staring at them, he gave no sign. Instead, he shrugged out of his suit jacket, draping it carefully over the back of his chair before taking a seat across from James. "So," Daniel said, picking up the menu with the casual air of someone who frequented establishments like Le Jardin regularly, "what looks good? I'm starving." At Margaret Lawson's table, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The smug superiority that had colored their conversation just moments ago had evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of unease. Margaret, her face a mask of confusion and growing horror, couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene unfolding before her. "I don't understand," she hissed to her friends, her voice pitched low in an attempt to avoid being overheard. "How can that man be related to someone so successful?" Vivian supplied, her own voice tinged with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. "Wealthy? Handsome?" Margaret shot her friend a withering glare, but couldn't formulate a response. Her mind was racing, trying to reconcile the shabby older man she had spent the last hour mocking with the clearly affluent and influential young man who had just called him Dad. Back at James and Daniel's table, the father and son were engrossed in conversation, seemingly oblivious to the stir they had caused. Daniel was animatedly describing his recent business trip to Tokyo, his hands moving expressively as he spoke about the potential new partnerships he had forged. "And then," Daniel was saying, his eyes twinkling with amusement, "the CEO of Nakamura Corp tried to outdrink me at the karaoke bar. Can you believe it? I had to channel some of that Marine Corps stamina you taught me, Dad." James chuckled, a warm, rich sound that seemed to cut through the tension in the restaurant. "Just remember, son, it's not about winning. It's about building relationships." Daniel nodded sagely. I know. And trust me, by the end of the night, we were singing duets and signing contracts. I think we've got a real shot at expanding into the Asian market now." As their conversation continued, touching on complex business strategies and global economic trends, the other diners in Le Jardin found themselves eavesdropping shamelessly. The easy rapport between father and son, the clear intelligence and business acumen displayed by both stood in stark contrast to the assumptions that had been made about James based solely on his appearance. Margaret in particular, seemed unable to process what she was witnessing. Her earlier bravado had crumbled, replaced by a growing sense of dread. She found herself analyzing every cruel word she had uttered, every mocking glance she had thrown James's way, now seeing them through the lens of potential consequences. If this young man was as influential as he appeared to be, her thoughtless actions could have serious repercussions. "Perhaps," Vivian suggested hesitantly, noting Margaret's distress, "we should leave, before anything else happens." But Margaret shook her head, her pride warring with her fear. "No," she said firmly, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "And that would only draw more attention. We'll finish our meal as planned. After all, we have as much right to be here as they do." Even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew they rang hollow. The easy confidence with which Daniel Porter carried himself, the respect shown to him by the staff, all spoke of someone far more at home in this world of luxury and privilege than Margaret and her friends could ever hope to be. As the meal progressed, the other diners in Le Jardin found their attention divided between their own plates and the fascinating tableau at James and Daniel's table. The older man's shabby jacket and weathered hands now seemed less a mark of poverty and more a badge of honor, the signs of a life lived with purpose and hard work. And Daniel, with his expensive suit and talk of international business deals, was a testament to the fruits of that labor. The waiter who approached their table did so with a deference that bordered on reverence. "Mr. Porter," he addressed Daniel, though his respectful glance included James as well. The chef wondered if you'd like to try our new tasting menu. It's not officially on offer yet, but for valued guests like yourselves. Daniel glanced at his father, a silent communication passing between them. That sounds wonderful, he replied smoothly. We'd be honored. And perhaps a bottle of the 82 Bordeaux to accompany it? The waiter nodded eagerly. An excellent choice, sir. I'll have that brought out right away. As the waiter hurried off, Daniel turned back to his father with a grin. See, Dad, I told you this place was worth trying, though I have to say, nothing beats your homemade chili. James laughed, the sound carrying across the restaurant. Flattery will get you everywhere, son. But I have to admit, it is nice to be out. Your mother would have loved this place. A shadow passed over Daniel's face at the mention of his mother, but it was quickly replaced by a warm smile. She would have. And she'd be so proud of you, Dad, of everything you've done, everything you continue to do. As father and son raised their water glasses in a silent toast, the atmosphere in Le Jardin seemed to shift once again. The earlier tension, born of cruel judgments and petty mockery, had been replaced by something altogether different, a sense of witnessing something genuine and valuable, a relationship built on mutual respect and deep affection. For Margaret Lawson, watching this scene unfold was like looking into a mirror that showed not her carefully maintained exterior, but the hollow core beneath. In the quiet dignity of James Porter and the easy confidence of his son, she saw everything that her wealth and social status had failed to provide: true respect, genuine connections, and a sense of purpose beyond mere accumulation of status symbols. As the first course of the tasting menu was brought to James and Daniel's table, accompanied by the sommelier presenting the expensive bottle of wine, Margaret found herself facing a moment of reckoning. The consequences of her actions were about to become clear, and she was suddenly, terrifyingly aware that she was not prepared for what was to come. The sommelier's practiced hands made quick work of uncorking the bottle of Bordeaux, the rich aroma of the vintage wine wafting through the air as he presented it to Daniel for approval. With a nod of appreciation, Daniel took a small sip, savoring the complex flavors before giving his assent. The sommelier then poured 2 glasses with a flourish, first for James and then for Daniel, before discreetly withdrawing. As father and son clinked glasses in a quiet toast, the hush that had fallen over Le Jardin was broken by the hushed whispers of other diners, their eyes darting between the porters on table and Margaret's group. The stark contrast between the earlier mockery and the current reverence was not lost on anyone in the restaurant. Margaret, her face a mask of conflicting emotions, couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the shabby older man she had so callously ridiculed with the father of this clearly influential young man. She leaned in towards her friends, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to find out who he is. Vivian, you know everyone. Do you recognize him? Vivian, still stunned by the turn of events, shook her head. I'm not sure. He looks familiar, but I can't quite place him. At that moment, as if the universe itself was conspiring to answer Margaret's question, a man at a nearby table stood up, approaching Daniel with an outstretched hand and a broad smile. Mr. Porter! Daniel Porter, isn't it? I didn't expect to see you here today. Daniel rose smoothly, shaking the man's hand with a warm smile. Mr. Holloway, it's good to see you. I'm just having lunch with my father. He gestured towards James, who nodded politely at the newcomer. Mr. Holloway's eyes widened slightly as he took in James's appearance, but to his credit, he didn't miss a beat. It's an honor to meet you, sir, he said, extending his hand to James as well. Your son's reputation precedes him. Porter Associates has been making waves in the business world. As the men exchanged pleasantries, Margaret felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Porter Associates was a name she knew well. It was one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the country, known for its innovative approaches and high-profile clients. And this young man, the son of the shabby veteran she had been mocking, was its CEO. Did you hear that? Vivian hissed, her eyes wide with shock. Porter Associates, Margaret, do you know what this means? Margaret nodded numbly, the full weight of her misjudgment crashing down upon her. She had spent the better part of an hour publicly humiliating the father of one of the most influential businessmen in the city, perhaps even the country. The potential ramifications of her actions began to unfold in her mind, each scenario more disastrous than the last. Back at the porter's table, Mr. Holloway was eagerly engaging Daniel in conversation. "I've been following your work with great interest, Mr. Porter. Your recent partnership with tech innovators is the talk of the industry. How did you manage to broker that deal?" Daniel, ever gracious, included his father in the conversation. "Actually, a lot of the credit for that goes to my dad here. His insights into team dynamics and leadership, honed through years of military service, were invaluable in navigating the negotiations." James, modest as ever, tried to demur. "Oh, I don't know about that, son. I just shared a few old war stories." "Don't let him fool you," Daniel said to Mr. Holloway with a grin. "Those old war stories contain more wisdom about strategy and human nature than most business schools could hope to teach. My father's experiences have been the foundation of my success." As Mr. Holloway nodded appreciatively, clearly impressed by both men, Margaret felt her world tilting on its axis. The man she had dismissed as unworthy of dining in Le Jardin was not only the father of a highly successful CEO, but was also, apparently, a key advisor to that success. Every assumption she had made, every cruel word she had uttered, now came back to haunt her with painful clarity. The conversation at the porter's table continued, with Mr. Holloway eagerly seeking Daniel's insights on various business matters. Daniel answered each question thoughtfully, often deferring to his father's opinion or sharing anecdotes that illustrated how James's military experience had shaped his business philosophy. "You know," Daniel was saying, "one of the most valuable lessons my dad taught me was about the importance of looking beyond appearances. In the military, he learned that the most unassuming person could be the one who saves your life in battle. I've applied that principle in business, always striving to see the potential in people and ideas that others might overlook." James nodded, a proud smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Daniel's always been good at seeing the best in people," he said. "It's a rare quality in the business world, I imagine." Mr. Holloway agreed enthusiastically. "Indeed it is, and it's clearly served him well. Porter Associates has a reputation for finding diamonds in the rough, both in terms of clients and employees. It's refreshing to see a company that values character and potential over pedigree and polish." As these words carried across the restaurant, Margaret felt each one like a physical blow. The very qualities she had sneered at, James's modest appearance, his quiet demeanor, were being lauded as virtues by men whose approval she had always craved. The irony was bitter indeed. Vivian, sensing Margaret's distress, attempted to salvage the situation. Perhaps we should introduce ourselves," she suggested hesitantly. "After all, it's not every day we have the chance to meet someone so influential." But Margaret, for once, was at a loss for words. The thought of facing Daniel Porter, of looking into the eyes of the man whose father she had so cruelly mocked, filled her with a dread she had never experienced before. Her usual confidence, born of wealth and social status, had evaporated in the face of true accomplishment and character. As the conversation at the porter's table continued, touching on topics ranging from global economics to ethical business practices, the other diners in Le Jardin found themselves captivated. The easy rapport between father and son, the depth of their insights, and the genuine respect they showed for each other and those around them stood in stark contrast to the shallow interactions that usually filled the air in such establishments. Margaret, watching this scene unfold, felt a profound shift in her perspective. For the first time in her life, she began to question the metrics by which she had always measured worth. In the quiet dignity of James Porter and the accomplished humility of his son, she saw a depth of character that all her designer clothes and social connections could never match. As the meal progressed and the revelation of Daniel Porter's identity spread through the restaurant, the atmosphere in Le Jardin transformed. The earlier tension, born of cruel judgments and petty mockery, gave way to a sense of witnessing something truly valuable, a relationship built on mutual respect, shared values, and a commitment to making a positive impact on the world. For Margaret Lawson, this transformation was both illuminating and terrifying. As she sat, paralyzed by the magnitude of her misjudgment, she realized that the true measure of a person lay not in their appearance or their bank balance, but in their actions and the lives they touched. It was a lesson she was learning far too late, and at a potentially devastating cost. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything Margaret thought she knew about status, success, and the true nature of dignity. As Daniel Porter finished his conversation with Mr. Holloway and turned his attention back to his father, Margaret braced herself for what was to come, knowing that her carefully constructed world of privilege and prejudice was about to be shaken to its very core. The gentle clink of fine china and the soft murmur of conversation had returned to Le Jardin, but beneath this veneer of normalcy, an undercurrent of tension thrummed through the air. At the center of this silent storm sat Margaret Lawson, her usual poise shattered, her manicured hands trembling slightly as she lifted her water glass to her lips. Across the room, Daniel Porter was concluding his conversation with Mr. Holloway. His easy charm and articulate responses a stark contrast to Margaret's earlier cruel caricature of his father. As Mr. Holloway departed with a respectful nod to both Porters, Daniel turned back to his father, his expression softening into one of genuine affection. "Sorry about that, Dad," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Sometimes it feels like I can't go anywhere without bumping into a client or potential investor." James waved off the apology with a smile. "No need to apologize, son. It's good to see you in your element. Your mother would be proud of the man you've become." The mention of Daniel's mother seemed to stir something in Margaret. Perhaps it was a flicker of recognition of shared loss, or simply the realization of the deep bond between father and son. Whatever the reason, she found herself rising from her chair, drawn almost against her will towards the Porter's table. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice lacking its usual imperious tone. "I couldn't help but overhear. You're Daniel Porter, of Porter Associates." Daniel turned, his eyebrows raising slightly as he took in Margaret's appearance. "Yes, that's right," he replied, his tone polite but guarded. "And you are—" "Margaret Lawson," she supplied, extending a hand that Daniel shook briefly. I just wanted to introduce myself. Your firm's reputation precedes you." As Margaret spoke, her eyes flicked nervously between Daniel and James. The older man's steady gaze seemed to pierce right through her, and she found herself unable to meet his eyes for more than a moment. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Lawson. I hope you're enjoying your meal?" The politeness of his tone seemed to embolden Margaret. Here, at last, was familiar territory, the dance of social niceties she had navigated her entire life. "Oh, yes, quite lovely," she replied, forcing a smile. "Le Jardin is one of my favorite establishments. The ambiance is usually so refined." As soon as the words left her mouth, Margaret realized her mistake. Daniel's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and she saw James stiffen slightly in his chair. "The ambiance," Daniel repeated, his voice cooling several degrees. "Yes, I suppose that's important to some people. Personally, I find the company matters far more than the setting." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She grasped for something to say, anything to salvage the situation. Of course. And speaking of company, your father must be so proud of your accomplishments. It's wonderful to see families supporting each other." It was the wrong thing to say. Daniel's expression hardened, and for the first time, Margaret saw a flash of the steel that had propelled him to the top of the business world. "My father," Daniel said, his voice low but intense, "has always supported me. But more importantly, I'm proud of him. Do you know why, Mrs. Lawson?" Margaret shook her head mutely, knowing that whatever came next would shatter her world entirely. "My father," Daniel continued, "is a decorated war hero. He served this country for over 3 decades, risking his life countless times so that people like you and me could enjoy the freedom to dine in places like this. He's seen and done things that most of us can't even imagine, And he's come out of it with his humanity and his compassion intact. James placed a hand on his son's arm, a silent request for calm, but Daniel wasn't finished. "And yet," he said, his voice rising slightly, drawing the attention of nearby diners, "despite all he's sacrificed, despite all he's accomplished, there are still people who look at him and see nothing but a shabby old man. People who judge him based on his appearance, who mock him for daring to enter their precious, refined spaces." Margaret blanched, the full weight of her actions crashing down upon her. I didn't know," she stammered. "I never meant to." "To what?" Daniel interrupted, his voice sharp. "To publicly humiliate a stranger? To make cruel jokes at the expense of someone you deemed beneath you? Tell me, Mrs. Lawson, what exactly did you mean to do?" The restaurant had fallen silent, all eyes now on the unfolding drama. Margaret felt the weight of those stares, the judgment she had so callously passed on others now turned back on her. It was James who finally broke the tension. "Daniel," he said softly, "that's enough." Daniel took a deep breath, visibly calming himself. "You're right. Dad, I'm sorry. This isn't the time or place." James nodded, then turned to Margaret. His eyes, when they met hers, were not filled with anger or resentment as she had feared. Instead, she saw something far worse: compassion. "Mrs. Lawson," James said, his voice gentle but firm, "I hope you understand that the worth of a person isn't measured by the clothes they wear or the company they keep. It's measured by their actions, by the kindness they show to others, especially those they believe can do nothing for them in return." Margaret felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I was wrong. So terribly wrong." James nodded, accepting her apology with a grace that made Margaret feel even smaller. "We all make mistakes, Mrs. Lawson. The important thing is that we learn from them." As Margaret stood there, caught between shame and a dawning realization of her own failings, she became acutely aware of the other diners watching the scene. The very people whose opinions she had valued so highly now looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. Daniel, seeming to sense her discomfort, softened his tone slightly. "Perhaps it's best if you return to your table now, Mrs. Lawson. I think we've all been given a lot to think about today." Margaret nodded numbly, turning to leave. But before she could take a step, James spoke once more. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, causing her to turn back. "Remember this feeling. Remember how easy it is to misjudge someone, to let our preconceptions blind us to the humanity in others. And next time you're tempted to look down on someone, ask yourself, what battles might they be fighting that I know nothing about?" With those words ringing in her ears, Margaret made her way back to her table on unsteady legs. Her friends, who had watched the entire exchange with a mixture of horror and fascination, were uncharacteristically silent as she sank into her chair. As the buzz of conversation slowly returned to Le Jardin, Margaret Lawson found herself staring at her half-eaten meal, her appetite gone. In its place was a gnawing emptiness, a realization that the pedestal she had placed herself upon was built on nothing more than air and illusions. The lesson she had learned today, delivered with both righteous anger and surprising compassion, would stay with her long after the taste of Le Jardin's exquisite cuisine had faded from her memory. And as she sat there, surrounded by all the trappings of wealth and status she had once valued so highly, Margaret Lawson began the long, difficult process of reevaluating everything she thought she knew about worth, dignity, and the true measure of a person's character. The aftermath of the confrontation left Le Jardin in a state of hushed awe. The usual chatter of high society dining had been replaced by quiet murmurs and thoughtful silence. At the center of it all, James and Daniel Porter continued their meal, the calm eye in the storm of emotions swirling around them. Margaret Lawson, still reeling from the encounter, sat motionless at her table, her friends unsure how to break the heavy silence that had fallen over them. The weight of her actions, the depth of her misjudgment, pressed down on her like a physical force. It was into this charged atmosphere that Mr. Holloway, the businessman who had earlier conversed with Daniel, approached the porter's table once more. This time, however, his attention was focused squarely on James. "Mr. Porter," he began, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "I couldn't help but overhear. You served our country?" James looked up, his weathered face creasing into a small smile. "I did, sir. 32 years in the Marine Corps." Mr. Holloway's eyes widened. 32 years? That's quite a commitment. Would you be willing to share some of your experiences? Daniel glanced at his father, silently asking if he was comfortable with the request. James nodded, gesturing for Mr. Holloway to take a seat. "Well," James began, his voice taking on a distant quality as he delved into memories long past. "I enlisted right out of high school. It was 1968, and the world was a different place." As James spoke, his words carried across the restaurant. Diners found themselves leaning in, drawn into the narrative of a life dedicated to service and sacrifice. He spoke of grueling training, of bonds forged in the crucible of combat, of moments of fear and triumph. "I remember my first tour in Vietnam," James said, his eyes focused on something far away. "I was just a kid, really, scared out of my mind. But I had my brothers beside me, and we looked out for each other." He recounted harrowing tales of jungle warfare, of nights spent listening to the distant sound of artillery, of friends lost and battles won. But it wasn't the combat that James lingered on. Instead, he spoke of the lessons learned, the wisdom gained through years of service. "You know," he mused, "people often think military service is all about following orders and conformity. But what I learned was the importance of adaptability, of thinking on your feet. And most importantly, I learned that the person next to you, regardless of their background, their race, their beliefs, that person might be the one to save your life. You learn to look beyond the surface pretty quick in those situations." As James spoke, Margaret found herself listening intently, tears welling in her eyes as she realized the depth of the man she had so callously judged. She heard tales of bravery, of selflessness, of men and women putting their lives on the line for ideals greater than themselves. James went on to describe his later years in the service, rising through the ranks, taking on leadership roles. "The hardest part," he said, his voice growing soft, "was sending young men and women into harm's way. Knowing that your decisions could mean life or death for someone's son or daughter, it weighs on you." Daniel, who had been listening with a mixture of pride and reverence, chimed in. "Dad doesn't like to brag, but he received multiple commendations for his service, including a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star." James waved off his son's words. "And medals don't make the man," he said firmly. "I knew plenty of heroes who never got recognized. The real reward was knowing we made a difference, that we protected those who couldn't protect themselves." As he continued, James touched on the challenges of returning to civilian life. "It's not easy," he admitted. "The skills you learn in the military don't always translate directly to civilian jobs, and the things you've seen, the experiences you've had, they stay with you. That's why I've dedicated much of my retirement to helping other veterans transition back to civilian life." This revelation caused a stir among the listeners. The man they had earlier dismissed or overlooked was not only a decorated veteran, but also a continued servant to his community. "That's actually how Daniel got the idea for some of his company's veteran outreach programs," James added, a note of pride in his voice. Daniel nodded. "Dad's insights have been invaluable. He's shown me how the skills veterans possess, leadership, adaptability, teamwork under pressure, are incredibly valuable in the business world. We've made it a priority to recruit and support veterans in our company." As James's story unfolded, the atmosphere in Le Jardin transformed. The earlier judgments and petty concerns seemed to evaporate in the face of such a profound narrative of service and sacrifice. Diners who had earlier been obsessed with status symbols and social climbing now sat in rapt attention, hanging on every word of a man they would have overlooked just hours before. Margaret, in particular, felt each word like a physical blow. The man she had mocked, the man she had deemed unworthy of dining in her presence, had lived a life of such depth and meaning that it made her own pursuits seem shallow in comparison. As James concluded his tale, a spontaneous applause broke out in the restaurant. It started softly, a few tentative claps, but quickly swelled into a standing ovation. James, ever humble, seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. "Please," he said, raising his hands. "I'm no hero. I just did my job, like so many others. If you want to show appreciation, do it by supporting the veterans in your communities. They're the ones who need it." As the applause died down and people began to retake their seats, there was a palpable shift in the air. The earlier atmosphere of exclusivity and judgment had been replaced by one of reflection and newfound respect. For Margaret Lawson, the change was even more profound. As she sat there, mascara streaking her cheeks, she realized that she had been given a priceless gift, the opportunity to recognize her own failings and the chance to become a better person. James Porter's story had done more than just captivate an audience. It had shattered preconceptions, challenged assumptions, and reminded everyone present of the true nature of dignity and worth. In the quiet aftermath of his words, the patrons of Le Jardin found themselves reevaluating not just their view of James, but of themselves and the values they held dear. As the last echoes of applause faded from Le Jardin, a profound silence settled over the restaurant. It was not the tense, uncomfortable quiet that had reigned earlier, but a thoughtful hush, as if each person present was internally grappling with the weight of James Porter's words and the depth of their own misjudgments. Margaret Lawson, her carefully applied makeup now streaked with tears, found herself unable to meet the eyes of her friends or fellow diners. The shame of her earlier behavior sat heavy in her chest, a physical ache that no amount of expensive wine or gourmet food could soothe. With trembling hands, she reached for her purse. I need to leave," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Her friends, equally subdued, nodded silently. As they rose to depart, Margaret cast one last glance towards the porter's table. James caught her eye and gave her a small, understanding nod. The simple gesture of kindness from a man she had so cruelly mocked was the final crack in her facade. Margaret hurried from the restaurant, her sobs barely contained until she reached the safety of the street outside. Back inside Le Jardin, the atmosphere was slowly returning to some semblance of normalcy, though the conversations were markedly different from the usual chatter of high society dining. At nearby tables, people spoke in hushed tones about their own experiences with veterans, of family members who had served, of the hidden struggles faced by those returning from war. The air was thick with contemplation and a newfound appreciation for the sacrifices made by those in uniform. Daniel Porter, watching the ripple effect of his father's words spread through the restaurant, turned to James with a mixture of pride and awe. "You know, Dad," he said softly, "I've heard your stories 100 times, but I never cease to be amazed by the impact they have on people." James shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's not about me, son. It's about reminding folks that there's always more to a person than meets the eye. We're all fighting battles others know nothing about." As they finished their meal, a steady stream of people approached their table. Some came to shake James's hand and thank him for his service. Others, inspired by his words, shared their own stories of struggle and resilience. A few even inquired about ways they could support veteran causes in their community. Among those who approached was the restaurant's owner, a distinguished man in his 50s who had been watching the day's events unfold with keen interest. "Mr. Porter," he said, addressing both James and Daniel. "I want to apologize for any discomfort you may have experienced in our establishment today. Please know that Le Jardin welcomes all who have served our country with open arms." James nodded graciously, but it was Daniel who spoke. "Thank you for your kind words," he said, his tone firm but polite. "But perhaps instead of simply welcoming veterans, you might consider actively supporting them. Have you thought about implementing a hiring program for veterans transitioning to civilian life? Or partnering with local veteran support organizations?" The owner blinked, momentarily taken aback, but then a slow smile spread across his face. "You know, Mr. Porter, I hadn't considered that. But I think it's an excellent idea. Perhaps we could discuss this further." I'd be very interested in learning more about how we can make a real difference. As Daniel exchanged contact information with the restaurant owner, James sat back, a contented look on his face. This, he thought, was the true power of sharing one's story, not just to change minds, but to inspire action. Hours later, as the sun began to set over the city, James and Daniel finally left Le Jardin. The restaurant had long since emptied of its lunch crowd, but the impact of the day's events lingered in the air like a tangible presence. "You know, Dad," Daniel said as they walked down the street, "I think you might have changed a few lives today." James chuckled softly. "Maybe so, son, but the real test will be tomorrow, and the day after that. It's easy to feel inspired in the moment. The challenge is holding on to that feeling and letting it guide your actions moving forward." As if to underscore James's words, they passed a small group of people huddled in the doorway of a closed shop. Among them was a man wearing a tattered military jacket, his weathered face bearing the unmistakable signs of a life lived hard. Without hesitation, James approached the group. "Evening, folks," he said warmly. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" The group looked up, surprise and a hint of wariness in their eyes. But something in James's demeanor, perhaps the way he carried himself, or the kindness in his eyes, put them at ease. Soon, James was engaged in conversation with the group, listening to their stories with the same attention and respect he had commanded in Le Jardin. Daniel watched from a short distance, marveling at his father's ability to connect with people from all walks of life. As he observed, he noticed a familiar figure approaching from down the street. It was Margaret Lawson, her earlier poise replaced by a hesitant, almost timid demeanor. Margaret paused when she saw James talking with the group, uncertainty written across her face. But after a moment's hesitation, she squared her shoulders and walked over. "Mr. Porter," she said softly, interrupting the conversation. I wanted to apologize again for my behavior earlier, and to ask, is there anything I can do? To help? To support veterans or anyone in need, really." James looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Well, Mrs. Lawson," he said, gesturing to the group around him, "why don't you start by listening? Everyone has a story to tell, if we're willing to hear it." And so, as the last light of day faded from the sky, an unlikely group gathered on that city street. A wealthy socialite, humbled and seeking redemption, a decorated veteran, sharing his wisdom and compassion, a successful CEO, witnessing the power of genuine human connection, and a group of individuals society had overlooked, finding their voices heard perhaps for the first time in years. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, the ripple effects of that afternoon in Le Jardin spread far and wide. The restaurant implemented a veteran hiring program and became a hub for community outreach. Margaret Lawson, true to her word, threw herself into volunteer work, using her social connections to raise awareness and funds for veteran support organizations. Daniel Porter's company expanded its veteran initiatives, setting a new standard in the business world for supporting those who had served. And James, ever humble, continued to touch lives in his quiet way, reminding everyone he met of the importance of looking beyond appearances to see the true worth of a person. The story of the veteran and the socialite became something of a local legend, retold in various forms as a reminder of the transformative power of empathy, understanding, and the simple act of truly seeing one another. And in every retelling, the message remained the same: that the true measure of a person lies not in their appearance or their possessions, but in the depth of their character and the impact they have on the lives of others. As for Le Jardin, it remained a bastion of fine dining and high society. But now, alongside the clink of fine china and the murmur of polite conversation, one might also hear the earnest discussions of patrons inspired to make a difference in their community. It stood as a testament to the fact that even in the most unlikely of places, a single act of kindness, a moment of understanding, can set in motion a chain of events that changes not just individual lives, but the very fabric of society itself.
Disclaimer. This channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.